Welcome back to Jackson County, Building Zion. This time we're going to do chapters 7, 8, and 9. Chapter 7. Coming from the small town of Iraq, Iraq, a man by the name of Aban Zaid was boarding a plane to fly to Egypt, where the closest Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints temple was then located. He and his wife Amira had been taught by Brett just over a year ago. Aban, working as a street merchant, had been saving for a year to be able to send their son to college, but when their son had learned about celestial marriage, he told his parents to fly to Egypt to be sealed. The hardest part of Aban's sacrifice was not spending the college money on the temple trip, but keeping his conversion a secret. His parents were devout Muslims as well as Amira's family. However, keeping the secret and saving the money was what the Lord wanted them to do. They were glad to make the sacrifice to be able to attend the Lord's temple. During a particularly hot week in April, Brett had the opportunity to help rebuild a home near the Euphrates River in Iraq. It was a very small home with only 2 rooms, but it was home to 8 people, 6 children, and 2 adults. Brett and his companion Neil had seen Father Zadak out working on his roof in late March. He had no interest in hearing about the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints Church, but he was willing to accept the elders' help for fixing his home. Aban knew Zadak very well, and he knew what courage it must have taken for Elder Larson and Elder Kelly to approach him and offer to help and teach him. Zadak was a good man, but he was also very stubborn. He was very set in his ways as a Muslim, just as his family had always been for many generations. Tradition and loyalty to the family were part of his core values. He never strayed from how his family would do things. Nothing was allowed to change from the way that it had always been. Aban watched Brett as he worked diligently on Zadak's home. After 3 weeks' worth of work and a lot of heavy labor, Elder Larson and Elder Kelly finished their work on the home, and they were thanked quickly by Zadak, who then closed the door on the missionaries. Aban tried to figure out why these 2 young men would work so hard for nothing. Brett had written home about helping Zadak, and he had taken good pictures of the progress and the day-to-day work to send home. Mom thought it was so great that she sent it to the New Era, where they wrote up a small story about Brett and his services in Iraq. It was when Brett and Neil started back toward home that Aban stopped Brett to talk to him about his service. "It's very nice of you to help out Zadak like that," Aban called out to Brett as he and Elder Kelly walked past his little shop. "Oh, do you know him?" Brett asked. "Yes, he's a friend of mine." "That's great. My name's Elder Larson, and this is my companion Elder Kelly." "Nice to meet you. You both have the same first name, Elder?" From that question, Brett started to explain that he and Elder Kelly were messengers of Jesus Christ, and that they both had the title of Elder, which was different from their first names. Aban had been brought up in a home that believed very strongly in hard work, and he was very impressed with Brett and the speed with which he was able to fix Zadak's home. Aban's father had taught him that he needed to develop the skills and use them to create a life for himself. He was also taught that his talents were gifts from Allah and that he must use them in serving others. From the first meeting, Elder Larson and Elder Kelly were able to set up appointments to come and teach Aban more about the gospel of Jesus Christ. After his first discussion, Aban asked if his wife Amira could listen in too. They were surprised that they didn't have to pay for the elder's services. After 2 months of discussions and prayer, both Amira and Aban were ready to be baptized and confirmed members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. It was one of the greatest conversion stories Brett had witnessed while on his mission, and it was one family that he liked to stay in contact with. Once they arrived in Egypt, Amira and Aban felt like they had traveled to a new world. Neither of them had ever left Iraq. It felt like even more of a new world when they finally entered the temple and were able to be sealed together as man and wife for a time in all eternity. Being from a place where death is common and widows are easy to be found, hearing about a marriage that could last beyond death was such wonderful news to hear. It was especially wonderful for Aban and Amira to hear, because early in their marriage, Aban faced a near-death experience. There had been an explosion at the shop just 3 doors down from his. The blast had shaken him up pretty badly, and he received several wounds from pieces of shrapnel. After Amira had found out about her husband's experience, he started to fear watching him go to work every day, not knowing if she would see him return home that night. Once they had left the temple, married for time in all eternity, Amira's smile was unmistakable, and the spirit of those 2 was so strong. After eating in the temple cafeteria, Aban and Amir walked down the street hand in hand until they reached an internet cafe where Aban could email his friend Elder Larson about the experience he had just had. Back in his room after a day of shopping, Brett was glad he had been able to talk to Savannah so easily. There were a lot of things that seemed like they were coming into place now, and there was no need to worry as much. Savannah said she needed to be supportive of his decision to go to Missouri, and on top of that, she had really a spiritual experience praying in the woods. Things were going great. On his computer, Brett had been doing research on the temple from church history documents when he noticed he got a new email. After reading it through and letting the tears freely fill his eyes, Brett printed off the letter from his dear friend Aban and brought it upstairs for his parents to read. Dear Elder Larson, you may not remember me, but my name is Aban. You taught me and my wife Amira the gospel just over a year ago. We wanted to share with you some exciting news. Over the past year, we were able to save enough money to send our son to college. But once he learned about celestial marriage, he told us to fly to Cairo to be sealed in the temple together. We wanted to tell you about the wonderful experience we had. From the first moment that I saw you working on Zadok's home, I knew there was a special spirit about you. I wanted to know why you acted the way you did, and why you were smiling the way you were. I think today, Amir and I really know why you were smiling. It's because of the truths and knowledge you have about the gospel of Jesus Christ. Without your willingness to teach us, we would have been left in the dark and would have never known that families can be together forever, and that we can repent of our sins and be forgiven. There's so many other wonderful truths that you helped teach us, I'll never be able to thank you enough. We wanted to tell you how special our wedding was. Just hearing that we would be together forever and that death would not separate us was wonderful. I will ever be grateful to God for his guidance in bringing you into my life to teach us the gospel. Thank you very much, and God bless you and your family. Aban. Brett had always wondered what happened to Aban and Amira, and receiving that email that night made Brett feel even more confident and ready to go to Missouri and help in the building of the temple. Brett understood that the work was never for his gain first, it was always for others. That was how Brett's mind and work ethic functioned. It had always seemed to Brett that there were too many people struggling and too many people needing help that he didn't have time to worry about himself or what he needed to do for himself. God had given him some great gifts and a very strong work ethic. Brett knew that all he needed to do was go to work and God would take care of the rest. It was one of the reasons why Brett made such a great missionary, because he could literally put his mind in the right frame where he could become an instrument in God's hands. Thinking about this family and how he helped them, Brett realized that building the temple was going to affect a larger scale of people than any other temple had before. For eternity, people will be able to look at Jackson County temples and say, what a great job the workers did. Every detail of it would add to this spiritual experience of so many. If he were going to pave the way for the work on a regular building, this may not be such an overwhelming thought, but he knew this situation was completely different. He was going to become an instrument in God's hands, and it didn't matter if he lacked in certain areas, and that the church could have chosen someone much better than he. He knew he was called of God, and that he knew he could be an effective tool in his hands. With all this going through his mind, Brett was really starting to feel excited about going to work. It would no doubt be a hard task, as it should be, but he knew the rewards would far outweigh the trials that would happen in the construction of the temples. The knowledge of that never bothered Brett. He knew that through trials come blessings. It was particularly exciting to think about for us, because temple builders were part of our family history. When the Logan Temple was being built, they had asked our great-great-great-great-uncle Thomas to come help with the construction. Back then, it was really like a mission call. The tasks Thomas had been given were great and would take time and skill to accomplish. But Thomas was up to the task. One of the tasks he was given was to sculpt the two spheres that would go on top of the temple. They'd be twin spheres, and according to the architect's plans, they had to be the exact same in measurement. So Thomas went to work on the spheres. He got one sphere done just perfectly, exactly to the architect's plans. Then he worked on the other. He just couldn't get the diameter to be the same. No matter how he carved it, it wouldn't measure out. So he told the architect his troubles, and he was told to keep working at it until the two spheres were the same. As hard as he tried, he just couldn't get the second sphere to the right specifications. But he knew that once on top of the temple, no one would be able to tell the difference anyway, even the architect. So when it came time to put the spheres on top, he left one sphere smaller in diameter than the other. When the architect saw it, he smiled and thanked Thomas for doing what he had asked and told him that as long as he stuck to the plans, everything would be great. Nobody could tell until many years later when they finally fixed the smaller sphere. Brett always thought that story was quite funny. The other great work he was known for was creating the water sealant compound for the bench used in the baptistry. They hadn't yet been able to come up with a compound that would protect the wood from all the water that would most likely damage it, Working hard on it, Thomas was able to make a great compound that has protected the bench all these many years. Brett wondered what great tasks he would be given on temples specifically. He didn't even know yet what they would really look like. From old files and archives, he had an idea, but he would just have to wait and see what tasks would be given him. Maybe he would only be working with the people, kind of like a modern day Enoch trying to get the city righteous enough for the temples to be built there. He had certainly come a long way from being a newly baptized member in the church. It was June of 2018, and Brett was to be baptized on a Saturday, along with many other stake baptisms. It didn't really feel like all that special of a day until after he was baptized. That amazingly clean feeling, along with the new companionship of the Holy Ghost, was something Brett had never felt before. All he knew was that he wanted to keep it with him all the time. So he learned what he needed to do to keep the Spirit with him. One of the best ways Brett found was through serving others. Any time he served others, he found that he forgot about himself and his feelings, and he focused on the feelings of those who he was serving. Then, before he knew it, he could feel the Spirit's presence, and it was a wonderful feeling. After reading the letter from Abban and having dinner with us, Brett went to his room to read his scriptures before he went to bed. He was in Alma 26, quite the appropriate scripture for him to read at that time. In verse 12, it talks about boasting. It says of missionary work that I know that I am weak, but in the strength of the Lord I can do much. Therefore I will not boast of myself, but boast of my God, for in him all things are possible. That was really how Brett was feeling, and he knew it was true. He had to become humble and submissive in order for the Lord to be able to use him as an instrument in helping to prepare the people for the temples. Savannah had felt like she was being really strong. When she had gone to pray about Brett's decision, she almost hoped that she would get an answer of it being wrong for him. Then she could tell him that he needed to stay and that there was work for him to do here. Still, she didn't really know fully how praying and receiving answers worked yet. It was a new feeling for her because letting Brett go to Missouri was something that she didn't really want in her head, but the Spirit caused her to feel calm about it and made her feel like she needed to be supportive of Brett. She didn't really talk to her parents too much about this. They would be forever grateful to Brett for saving Savannah's life, and they thought he was a great friend for Savannah to hang out with. But having Brett convert her to his church was something they didn't really like talking about. There was so many things going on in the world that made the church feel uncaring and non-accepting in the Michelsons' mind. They had many friends who had gay marriages, and according to our church, we don't support that, and many members have made their voices heard in voting against gay marriage. Another thing that Savannah's parents couldn't accept was the church's stance on tithing. Especially with the economy the way it was, the Michelsons couldn't understand how the church could ask its members to pay 10% of their income when most of the time they probably couldn't afford it. Savannah had come a really long way since she was 8 years old as well. Back then, she didn't really worry about anything. Her parents let her do really whatever she wanted within reason. They were very much believers in the eat, drink, and be merry philosophy. Now here she was in her 20s, getting ready to go to college, after finally saving up enough money to go. She was no longer watching bad movies or drinking coffee with her parents. She was going to some devotionals and even a sacrament meeting here and there. Still, there was always one thing holding her back from getting baptized, and that was her parents. Without letting them know, she could sneak off to a sacrament meeting or two, and she could go to a devotional every once in a while, but once she was a member of the church, things would change. There would be church every week, paying tithing and everything else that comes from living the life of a Latter-day Saint. She would not be able to keep all of that from her parents. Lying there on her bed, trying to fall asleep, all of these thoughts were running through her head. She started to wonder if it was really her parents that were keeping her from getting baptized or if it was her. Then she started to think of how her life would change if she joined the church. Maybe her parents wouldn't want anything to do with her anymore. She knew they loved her, but would converting to Mormonism change all that? What if they kicked her out? She was going to college anyway. Maybe it was time she did get baptized. Ultimately, she had to ask herself, what was the most important to her? Getting baptized and joining the church, or staying on her parents' good side? Chapter 8. When Brett had called the stake president to let him know he was taking the assignment, the stake president did mention that further instructions would be sent, and that he would know better what to buy and just more in general about his duty. The fact of the matter was that he knew things about missionary work and was more or less what he needed, but never in his life had he been asked to work on something so magnificent before. Just as he had thought, in the mail there was a letter from the First Presidency, and he hoped that more of his questions would be answered. Sitting at the kitchen table, working on his orange juice and grape nuts, Brett felt tired. He almost felt like going back to sleep, but he knew there was work to be done. It was most likely the fact that his schedule had changed so much. He could have woken up around 6 and had scripture study and prayer like he would have on the mission, but it was starting to get later and later at night when he would fall asleep, thus it was getting later and later in the morning when he was waking up. No one was around either to do things with him. Mom and Dad were out at work at their boot shop, or at least until 2. They would make it home around 3. Mom and Dad own a boot repair business. Then there was Nancy and me, who were at school. He was alone with his thoughts, and he could do really what he wanted. Well, at least up until he would be leaving for Missouri. Finally opening up the letter, Brett read his further instructions. Dear Elder Larson, thank you once again for your willingness to accept a call from the Lord to serve. Given the size of this project, many members were called to serve, and with your added help, together we'll be able to build a very important temple to the Lord. But first, the people must be prepared as well. On May 17th, 2030, the church will begin construction on the temple, and you will be asked to serve as one of the many missionaries. The church has prepared a place for all missionaries to stay where rent will be paid, and a weekly living allowance will also be given out while you live in Missouri working with the people. We request that you report to the Pepperwood Apartments on 19400 East 37th Terrace Court, South Independence, Missouri, on May 16th at 10 a.m., where a church representative will meet you. Included is a shopping list of items you may want to bring. The project is expected to take 5 years to complete, thus you are called to serve from May 16th, 2030 to May 17th, 2035. The temple will be dedicated on May 24th, 2035. Because of your service, you will be able to bring 3 people to the temple dedication. Once again, we thank you for your willingness to serve, and we will see you on May 16th. Sincerely, the First Presidency. It really was what Brett had been expecting. Most temples take about 2 years to complete, and this was really like 24 small temples, with probably many more workers than usual from the sounds of it. And he would be working with many other missionaries to help prepare the people for these temples. It also sounded like they would be taking care of living expenses and his housing as well. So really there wasn't much else for him to really bring besides his talents in missionary work. It was a different feeling for Brett, just to know that the temple would be dedicated in about 5 years. He could tell his parents when it would be. The next thing he wanted to do was to look up the Pepperwood Apartments so that he'd know where he'd be staying. It was going to be a great year. Last month marked the 200th anniversary of the restoration of the church. Not only that, the prophet announced the Jackson County, Missouri Temple Project. He was so glad that Savannah was able to watch it, even though she had to try and watch it without her parents knowing. Looking back on that conference, I remember that by the Saturday afternoon session, Brett and the rest of us were sitting together in the family room watching General Conference together. Brett thought back on the last conference he had watched in Iraq. There he was on the outskirts of Iraq, almost in the middle of nowhere. The non-Mormons of Iraq wouldn't have a chapel anywhere near the main town square. They would tolerate these Mormons practicing their religion, but it had to be done almost in secret. The chapel was probably about a third the size of his chapel back home, but for the 100 or so members in the district, it was plenty of room. The prophet got up that Saturday afternoon session and announced that the church was making great strides in building more temples, and that some great projects would be in the works soon. Who knew that back then those great projects he was thinking about would include Independence, Missouri, the New Jerusalem. Brett had already felt like he was helping expand the work by serving in Iraq, and now here he was 6 months later, and his work would be helping expand the work more than ever. Brett was having a strange feeling, though. He was feeling different in relationship to the Spirit. It's kind of hard to describe, but as a missionary in Iraq, he could actually feel and sense the Spirit with him as a protection and guide. Once back in Wyoming, the protection wasn't needed as much anymore, at least not the physical protection. It wasn't that he wasn't feeling the Spirit during General Conference, he was. It was just that he was starting to miss that protective feeling. The morning session had been great, and Brett thought it was fitting that the talks were focusing on temple and genealogy work. Now here they were listening to the choir at Temple Square singing the Spirit of God, and soon the prophet would announce the great project. It was on that last verse that Mom heard the door, and in no time Savannah had made her way downstairs to sit next to Brett to watch the session. No words needed to be exchanged. Brett just gave Savannah that smile, and they both felt relaxed and ready for whatever the Lord had in store for them. Soon the hymn was over, and the prophet got up ready to give the news. We want to continue bringing temples closer to the ever expanding membership of the church. So we are pleased to announce plans to construct 4 more temples. Those temples will be located in the following locations: Moscow, Russia; Beijing, China; Bangalore, India; and Independence, Missouri. It felt like the entire church was holding its collective breath those few seconds before the prophet continued on. It was very similar to the April 2018 conference when the first Russian and Indian temples were announced. The Independence, Missouri temple, due to its larger project size, is set to be completed in 5 years. The prophet then showed the mock-up picture of the project and explained to the members that there was no need to flock to Independence and that they would be updated on the project as it progresses. It was so wonderful the way he handled it. Of course, members everywhere knew what the announcement meant, and excitement was everywhere. But he also announced it in such a calm, safe manner that everyone felt calm and at peace. Although it was a hard message to follow, the prophet announced the speakers, and up came the acting president of the Quorum of the 12. Brett always loved listening to him speak and listening to his stories. It reminded him of how Christ taught people through parables. His topic, though Brett couldn't tell at first, was greatly related to the news the prophet had just delivered. He started talking about how he became a bishop, and then he explained to the church what he felt was the most important work he did, and that was temple recommend interviews. The temple work still needed to be done. The temple work still needing to be done was great, and he explained the need to be temple worthy. Brett realized that a lot of work would take place in New Jerusalem. Something Brett wondered about was when the old Jerusalem temple would be announced. Of course, he realized the Lord has everything in hand. Brett found it hard to focus on General Conference after that talk. He could feel a vibe coming from Savannah next to him, but more importantly, he was feeling closer to her. In his head, he tried to think about her conversion and about the day she would be baptized. He had faith that it would be soon, and he secretly hoped he would get to baptize her. Looking at her out the corner of his eye, Brett couldn't help but notice that Savannah was paying rapt attention to Conference. He almost envied her because she knew how important Conference was and she was sacrificing to watch it. She had to lie to her parents to come over and watch it with us. After the rest hymn, the prophet got back up to announce the rest of the speakers. It was then that the second counselor in the first presidency got up to deliver a talk that Brett would remember the rest of his life, and it was one that would come in handy later during the temple construction. He started by sharing a very personal experience about a time he got to visit Jerusalem. He talked about a great realization he had. As I was walking another path that Christ walked, I couldn't help but feel a little let down. I was a young college student, and I had thought that by going to Jerusalem and walking in the paths that Christ walked, that I would feel an extra closeness to the Savior. What I had come to realize is that I had felt the same Spirit before many times already in the temple. The reason the Spirit is the same is that Christ does walk the floors of all his temples on the earth today. They are his homes, and they are built in such a fashion that his Spirit will reside in them. It was a life-changing talk, and there were parts that Brett knew he would remember forever. But at that moment, he was just happy that he was sitting next to Savannah. He was starting to realize he could almost feel that same protective spirit coming from her that he did in Iraq. It was like the Lord had sent her spirit to him in Iraq to help him feel more at home. She truly was an angel sent down to help Brett with something, but he wasn't really sure what yet. Such a special, loving spirit like hers was too precious to be lost. She would definitely convert. It was just a matter of when. The closing hymn, sung by the choir, couldn't have been better. They sang For the Beauty of the Earth. It was one of Brett's favorite hymns. It was such a wonderful session. Chapter 9. Brett was very much enjoying the time he was getting to spend with Savannah. He took it as a good sign that she was willing to sacrifice to see Conference, and that of all places she could have watched it, she chose to do it with Brett. Of course, it was probably where she felt most comfortable watching it, but still, Brett had to wonder how close she really was to getting baptized. What Brett didn't really know was how things were going at Savannah's home. After Savannah got home after the Sunday afternoon session of Conference, things between her and her parents took a turn for the worst. Savannah, can you come in here for a minute? Your father and I would like to talk to you. Just by the sound of her voice, Savannah knew it wasn't going to be good, but she really hadn't done anything wrong. I mean, she had been watching Conference with Brett. There was nothing wrong with that, and really she didn't tell her parents that because it was none of their business. Yes, Mom? Savannah, we want to talk to you about your relationship with Brett, Miss Michelson explained. Mr. Michelson tried to look busy reading a paper at the kitchen table while they spoke in the kitchen. Miss Michelson had been busy making roast chicken for dinner, but now she was concentrating on Savannah. She was really worried about her daughter. She just wanted to make sure Savannah knew what she was doing. What do you want to know? Savannah said, trying to be helpful. Well, how serious are you guys? Miss Michelson said, trying to be stealth. Mom, we aren't fooling around. You know Brett's stance on that, Savannah said, incredulous of her mother's assumption. No, I know that. I just wanted to know how you felt about him. He's a great friend, Mom. I wouldn't say we're way serious or anything. Would you call him your boyfriend? Savannah thought for a moment. They had dated quite a bit, and Savannah did see him a lot. Yeah, I would call him that. After hearing that, Miss Michelson took her time trying to put together her thoughts on what she wanted to say next. She tried looking to her husband, but he wasn't being of much help. He took the stance that it was up to Savannah what she wanted to do with Brett. He felt that in the end she would make the right decision. Miss Michelson felt differently. They had lied in bed Saturday after realizing that Savannah had been with Brett, probably watching conference. They didn't know much about it, but they knew it was very important to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints community. And since that was the case, Miss Michelson was afraid of how it may affect Savannah. Savannah, you know we've talked about how we feel about his faith before, and you know where we stand on that, right? Yes, Mom, you've made your position very clear, Savannah said, frustrated. Now, we're not saying that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints faith is bad or anything. In fact, I think it's great for Brett. It makes him who he is, Miss Michelson said, pausing before finishing her thought. But you don't think it would be right for me? Is that it? Savannah said angrily. The bright afternoon sun was shining clearly through the window now, making the intense situation hotter than it already was. Savannah had always had a great relationship with her mother, but ever since Brett came along, Savannah had been acting different. Things between them changed, and it felt like they were growing further and further apart. Savannah hadn't really wanted to get into it. That is why she was avoiding telling them about conference, but now she felt angry and like she needed to defend herself. It's not that it wouldn't be right for you, Savannah. It's just that... Just what, Mom? It's just that... Have you thought about how it would change your life if you decided to join his church? Now it had really come out. And now Mr. Michelson felt he needed to get involved. He stood up from his place at the table and went over to his wife. Darling, remember we talked about this. Savannah will make the right choice in the end. There's no need to worry. This really made Savannah angrier. She didn't know what was going on and why her parents were suddenly acting so crazy. She had spent plenty of time with Brett before, and they hadn't really said anything. But now it seemed everything was coming out. Looking around her as the argument progressed, in her mind, Savannah started to hate the stupid white and blue cupboards and white-tiled floor of the kitchen. She hated the light yellow curtains and the stupid scenery outside of them. She hated most of all that this once lovely home now felt like a prison to her. Savannah, we have nothing against the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints faith, really. We just want what's best for you, that's all. Oh, Mother, don't lie. You said before you hate their tithing law and their stance on gay marriage. So don't sit there and try to tell me that you have nothing against them, because you do. The fight had escalated until Savannah and her mother had to be separated. Miss Michelson looked as if she was going to hit Savannah, and that's when Mr. Michelson grabbed his wife so that Savannah could run down to her room. It had been quite the emotional day for Savannah. She had felt the Spirit so strongly during General Conference, but that Sunday night was a night that would change Savannah's life forever. She lay there on her bed with so many thoughts running through her mind. How much do I really need to be a Mormon? Can I really deny it's true? Why are my parents so against a religion that feels so right to me? The commandments say, honor thy father and thy mother, but how can I do that when they're against the things that I'm feeling for this church? It was this, plus a culmination of a lot of things, that caused Savannah to go to the Laramie River to pray. Things kept getting more heated at home, especially with Savannah spending more time with Brett as he got ready to leave again. It was around 1 in the morning, almost a month after the fight, when Savannah had a few bags packed and loaded into her car. Her parents were sound asleep upstairs, and as Savannah got into her car, she felt no remorse for what she was doing. This is what she had to do. She did feel scared and she didn't know where she would go. All she knew was that she needed to go, and the sooner the better. The bright stars in the sky were Savannah's only companions as she kept on driving through the night. She drove silently, just listening to her thoughts and trying to calm herself. When she had first gotten her car, she wanted to go to our house, but then she realized what she was really doing. She had to ask herself, did she really believe in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints Church? Or did she only love it because it brought her and Brett closer together? She decided that since Brett was leaving her soon anyway, she might as well get out on her own. Waking up that Monday morning, I remember Brett getting that phone call and having his stomach sink to the floor. The Michelsons had called looking for Savannah and sounding more worried than Brett had ever heard them. Immediately, Brett went out on the search for her. The bright sun mixed with Brett's tears made driving a chore, but what was worse was that Brett would be leaving in just a few days, and his mind and energy were just not in it. He needed to find Savannah, and he needed things to be right between them before he could dedicate himself to working on this great project. Between the Larsons and the Michelsons, we had covered most of Wyoming in a few days. The Michelsons had called the police, but really because Savannah was over 18, there wasn't much they could do. She was out on her own somewhere, doing what she wanted to do. The Michelsons felt bad thinking it, but they were kind of glad to find out that Savannah hadn't run away with Brett. Soon the time had come for Brett to get everything ready, as he needed to get to the airport bright and early the next morning. It was May 15th now, and Savannah had been gone for far too long. Brett hadn't been able to get a good night's sleep since that Monday morning he learned Savannah was missing. It didn't matter too much, though, because Brett didn't feel much like sleeping. It would be his last night at home for a long time, and the world would be changing a lot in the next few years. Brett looked around his small room with its dark blue trim and faded white walls. I remember when he helped our parents paint that room several years ago. He had so many memories going through his mind of great times he had spent in that house. Still, his mind wouldn't let him forget that Savannah was still missing. He was more worried about that than he was about working in Missouri. That just didn't seem right to him. Finally, around 4:30 in the morning, Brett's alarm went off, but only for a second, as Brett hadn't slept and was able to turn it off. Mom and Dad were going down to Missouri with Brett to get him settled into his apartment. It'd be a long day, as Brett needed to be settled in and ready to meet the church's representative at 10 in the morning. Riding in the back seat of Mom and Dad's car, Brett felt more tired than he had ever been in his life, though he couldn't sleep. There were so many things changing that day, and he didn't feel ready for it. We all knew what Brett was going through, and we were just as worried about Savannah as he was. Even during the short plane ride into Missouri, Mom and Dad didn't know what they could say to Brett to help relieve the pain that he was going through. It wasn't until the taxi had parked at the apartments that a smile came across Brett's face. This was it. This is where all the great and glorious times of his life would be. He was now starting on his mission of getting the people prepared for the new Jerusalem.